This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Eugyppius, The Sceptic's Germany correspondent, on why the German election result could spell the end of the firewall against the AfD.
It's only a 13-seat majority of a 630-seat Bundestag. It's going to be extremely awkward maneuvering over the next years, trying to craft laws that the AfD can't possibly vote for, just so that there's no accidental violations of the firewall. I think we're just facing a very bizarre time.
Professor Eric Kaufmann, author of books including Whiteshift and Taboo, on a recent controversy over whether Rishi Sunak is English and whether the Trump administration can reverse woke culture.
Until you get into the schools, until you actually start shilling people who try and relabel offices of DEI or relabel critical race theory as something else and still keep teaching the same stuff, it's going to be a long process of actually weeding all this stuff out and keeping it out.
For our premium subscribers, I speak to Chris Bayliss, independent consultant and writer for publications including The Critic, on what's behind the shocking recent wave of migrant terror attacks across Europe.
Looking back to the nature of Islamist terrorism, what we're facing now is very different. These are basically people that are deeply confused, deeply lost, isolated, alienated, and that they're just lashing out at whatever they can find.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month for The Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Now, at this week's snap election in Germany, the centre-right Christian Democratic Union topped the polls, setting leader Friedrich Merz on course to form a coalition with the left-wing Social Democrats. But with the populist right AfD coming in a handsome second and some messy political compromises looming to get the socialists on board, could this be a Pyrrhic victory for the CDU? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined once again on The Sceptic by our Germany correspondent, Eugyppius, the author of Eugyppius, A Plague Chronicle, the Substack, and also recently, as we're going to discuss, online correspondent of the Vice President of the United States. So welcome to The Sceptic, Eugyppius.
Oh, well, thank you so much for the invitation and generous introduction. It's a pleasure, as always, to be speaking with you today.
Yeah, good to have you here. Okay, so we'll get into some more of the implications in a second, but to start with, just give us a rundown of what's happened in this election.
So the election on Sunday went pretty much exactly as expected, as all the polls told us it would. We have the alleged winner of the election is the Christian Democrats, the Christian Social Union, the big center-right parties, with about 28.5% of the vote. That's a historically dismal result, but they are the strongest party, and that's a little weaker than I thought they would come in at. Then we have second place is the Social Democrats, so the big left, center-left kind of party, with about 16.4%. And, actually, that third place, AfD, is the second place winner, Alternative für Deutschland, but the idea that they're going to be excluded from government, right? So because of the firewall, and AfD came in at 20.8%, almost 21%, exactly what I predicted. So there's going to be an election, a coalition now between the Christian Democrat Party and the Social Democrats. They're going to have a very thin majority in the Bundestag of about 13 seats. And they're going to, over the next month, try to hammer out some kind of coalition agreement. It's going to be very difficult. The Social Democrats are going to take everything possible from the Christian Democrats because the Christian Democrats are desperate to form a coalition here without the AfD. The Social Democrats are the only option. The Greens came in too weak. The FDP, the Free Democrats, the market liberals aren't even in the Bundestag now. So that's the rough picture of things. Pretty much as expected, no really big surprises.
And so obviously there's been a lot of expectation on the AfD as to be this kind of upending force in this election. And as you mentioned there, they actually just got about what they were expected to, maybe even 1% above that. And yet there's been a lot of commentary online saying really that they didn't seize the opportunity that they were supposedly had, and that they almost had failed in a way. I mean, that's not quite a fair characterization, is it?
No, I don't think so. So there's been a number of things happening in sort of the online commentary space. One is that, of course, MAGA Americans have really just pumped up a lot of expectations and led even in Europe, even here in Germany, to this sort of belief that we're on the verge of a huge political change and that there should be a major upset and so forth. And, we are just not United States. We are in a different phase of our political development, not unrelated, but we are further behind, and we're just not there yet right now. There's a lot of sort of, again, I think American spread ideas that our polls, there may be a shy AfD voter effect, that maybe our polls are underestimating AfD voter share and so forth, which is never true at all. I mean, you can compare polls, you can pretty much work out if there's big errors here or not. And I always thought the polls were pretty accurate. They seem to correlate with each other well, and they were correct. There's really never been a sort of the huge polling errors that you see in America don't exist here. Another argument you heard all the time was that the AfD had unusually good conditions because Elon Musk and JD Vance were implicitly or even explicitly supporting them. I think this is really kind of withdrawn from the political reality in Germany. Musk's support did, I think, give AfD a slight bump of 1.5 percentage points, but Germans don't respond to endorsements by American politicians directly. And you have to remember also that these endorsements caused huge hysterical anti-AfD reactions in our press and everything on this side, which have a corresponding negative effect on AfD support. So all in all, I thought we did pretty well. And yeah, exactly as expected. I would not be too disappointed or depressed about the results.
And you mentioned the hysterical denunciations and things like this, and there have actually been a lot of headwinds for the AfD in getting to this point already. And of course, one shouldn't forget that they've actually made about a 10-point gain on their previous performance in 2021. So, I mean, that's quite something, isn't it?
Yeah, they doubled their support since 2021. And I would say that the AfD has become an unusually resilient party just in the space of the last year. So we had some of the most insane social media attacks this last time around. Things I've never really seen before. Just the one-sided reporting and truly hysterical attacks all the time on state media broadcasting. And the last time AfD was really subjected to a sustained campaign like this was in the run-up to the European elections last year. And that really did have an effect that AfD lost 25-30% of their support in the wake of these attacks. This time it did nothing at all. It shows me that the sort of constant wandering of CDU voters towards AfD. This is a long process of disillusionment. These aren't just temporarily shifting alliances. These voters are here to stay, and the media attacks are increasingly powerless. I think overall a good result.
And so in terms of the shifting sands then, so the SPD is the party that's performed historically very, very poorly. And then that's been shedding voters to the CDU, and the CDU in turn has been shedding voters to the AfD. So it seems as if the whole political system is shifting to the right.
Yeah, it seems to be that there's this sort of a two-step process. So the only reason the union parties aren't shrinking faster than they are is that they are collecting votes from the left the whole time, and they are also losing them to AfD at a similar rate. So there's this sort of two-step process of disillusionment, and I think that what's really going to be interesting, I think this actually is a phenomenon, explains a number of things. For example, why CDU keeps playing to the left a lot. I think they see a lot of voters wandering from the left, a lot of new party members from left parties, and they feel they have to sort of play a sort of center-left politics, which is, I think, a strategic mistake on their part, but I think it also explains something of the psychology of Friedrich Merz and a lot of CDU politicians. But an important question coming up is when will the CDU have exhausted all of the potential defectors from the Greens and the SPD? Because after that point, they're going to just shrink and shrink. They'll just lose voters to AfD without any potential to draw anymore. And I think really they've drawn all the voters they're going to draw from the Free Democrats, from the Market Liberal Party. That party is done. They're almost wiped out. The Greens are approaching their core religious fanatical voter base. So I think that's about 8 to 10% of Germans, and their Greens came in at 11% right now. So there are not really many Green voters left to defect to the Union. And really, question is, how low can the SPD go? I think that's the last reserve of potential voters over the coming year.
I mean, that's another important story here, isn't it? I mean, the CDU, obviously, they won, they got the most votes, and they've been talked about as the winner here. But given that the left-wing traffic light coalition was so historically unpopular, and that they're the centrist, centre-right alternative, they should have been expecting to do much, much better, shouldn't they? I mean, they've underperformed.
Yeah, they should have finished in the high 30s, really. And even that would have been just a middle-of-the-road mediocre result for them. To come in at 28.5% against the most hated government in the history of polling in Germany is for what is historically Germany's strongest party. You know, the CDU used to govern with 48% of German support, you know. Now to finish at 28% against the traffic light coalition, against this absolute clown car of a government, is just a disgraceful result. And there's a lot trying to play this up as winners in the press and so forth, but they're also losers too. They came in so weak. It's really we're seeing just historical shift in German political relationships. The Union is becoming a very weak party, which is, for the first time in my life, it's very, very surprising.
Okay, and so given that, the question is, what's the coalition going to be and who's going to be in it? And so it seems like the Kenya coalition, so the black, green and red, has been avoided. Why is that? And tell us what's going to happen.
Yeah, so the big question was whether the alliance for Sarah Wagenknecht, this sort of splinter party from Die Linke, from the left party, whether the BSW, the Alliance for Sarah Wagenknecht, was going to make it into the Bundestag. Because the way the math works out, Bundestag is fixed at 630 seats. So if more small parties make it in, the bigger parties are weaker. And so the big question was, well, we're going to have a Kenya coalition of the Union parties, the SPD and the Greens all together, which would be an absolute disaster for CDU. And that would be almost mathematically demanded if the BSW made it in. Or is the BSW going to fail to make it in, and then maybe the CDU can form a majority with only the Social Democrats. And the BSW, at the last, it was counting votes until 2 a.m. on Monday morning. It finally emerged that they had failed to make it into the Bundestag by 13,000 votes, so very close. And so the CDU was spared the absolute apocalypse scenario of having to coalition with two left parties. They only need one partner now, and that's going to be the SPD. Now, this is not all good news. The SPD has been extremely radicalized. I think one of the consequences of shedding voters to the Union and losing a lot of their base is that what remains of the SPD are very hard leftist people. So they're no longer a center-left party. They're increasingly a hard left party. And these failures have actually radicalized them. And if you look at the kinds of people, the list candidates who are making it into the Bundestag, these are all hardline socialists now. The sort of the party of Gerhard Schröder, sort of centrist, market liberal kind of, but with some welfare features added on. That whole politics for the Social Democrats is over with. So they've moved very far apart from the Christian Democrats. It's going to be very difficult coalition negotiations. A lot of the activist wing of the SPD is extremely fired up about what would you, of course, about the, sorry, I'm having trouble finding the words, about the entire firewall violations in January, and are demanding that the SPD go into opposition. So all the activists are feeling very militant right now. There's going to have to be an entire internal process within the SPD of calming people down and promising them various rewards and sinecures once they're in the government to make the coalition acceptable to their base. So it's going to be a very difficult series of negotiations, and the CDU are going to have to give up great parts of what they promised their voters. So it's going to be a very unpopular, very directionless and very weak government, I think.
Right. So the SPD is very fractious and the majority won't be very large. So does that raise the possibility of one vote here or there bringing down the firewall in this government?
Yeah. So this is something I just thought about. It's only a 13-seat majority of a 630-seat Bundestag. So you have to imagine, there's always going to be some people who are sick that day or who are just pissed off about this vote. And you have to enforce iron party discipline, but even then, a few people always, they're not there, or they, for whatever reason, they defect on specific votes. There's going to be votes in the future of years that come down to 2 or 3 people, very small majorities. And this could have put the CDU in a very awkward position, because the firewall, they're not allowed to achieve any results with AfD votes, right? So if they propose some kind of legislation and the SPD, their coalition partners, aren't fully on board, or the hard left wing of the faction is not really going to vote for that, the danger is always going to be that the AfD votes come up and let the legislation pass anyway, and then it's going to be, huge media freak out, big hysteria. It's going to be extremely awkward legislative maneuvering over the next years, trying to craft laws that the AfD can't possibly vote for, would never conceivably support, just so that there's no accidental violations of the firewall. I think we're just facing a very bizarre time. And I personally wonder how stable this government is going to be in the longer run. I think especially if pressure grows on the Christian Democrats to do something about immigration, or do something about any number of problems, economic issues, and the SPD remain recalcitrant, and they're a very activist party now. They're going to be very reluctant to go along with anything. There's going to always be this pressure to use AfD votes, and that would bring down the government. So it's interesting.
And of course, this is likely to be benefiting the AfD, isn't it? Because they're not going to be in government, so they're not going to have to compromise on any of their principles. And of course, Alice Weidel, the leader, has issued this warning to the CDU that they shouldn't water down any of their policies that have actually tried to, really steal from the playbook of the AfD on immigration once they get into government. But it looks like they are going to be watering these things down, and that's going to play very well for the AfD, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. The CDU is already, I think Friedrich Merz, their chancellor candidate, is a very interesting figure psychologically, and one should perhaps write more about him. He's already just within a day of winning, in air quotes, the elections, he's already come out and said, the whole thing about the debt break, which is actually a promise in the CDU party platform, forget about that. We're going to reform that anyway, trying to play to potential SPD coalition partners. He's like, now he's denying that his party ever said they would close the borders, which is also very crazy and bizarre. So within 24 hours of winning the election, he's like, in massive betray everybody mode here to make a government happen. And obviously this benefits the AfD. It's very bizarre. The firewall was conceived of to keep the AfD out of power, and it's become one of their greatest strengths. And the more it's insisted on, the more they're not allowed to govern, the stronger the party will become. One of the worst things that could happen to AfD right now, and I think it would be, of course, an acceptable hit. You have to take this, you have to govern, would be for the CDU to welcome AfD into government, and then they would be moderated. They'd have to give up a lot of their, their Euro-skepticism, their NATO-skepticism, a lot of these sort of populist positions that exist in Europe. They'd have to sort of shed those or play them down. People would be disappointed. Of course, political processes are always compromised. Nothing's perfect. That would really hurt the AfD, and I could see them becoming then a 15% party again or something. But no one's going to let that happen. They're going to make sure they're the dominant party before anyone tries to govern with them. I think it's really just strategically, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's a very strange dynamic. And if you had to predict, clearly this government is going to be quite unstable. But how long do you think it's going to be around for?
I don't know. I think maybe 50% chance they actually last 4 years. But they're not going to be able to achieve very much. They are going to displease both sides of the political spectrum. The CDU is going to be very reluctant to give the Social Democrats what they want in terms of more social welfare spending. The SPD is not going to be able to give the Christian Democrats anything they want as far as migration goes. The only things the government can really do that they might both agree on, I think, and this is not totally bad, that's also why I'm not so black-pilled about it, is wind back a lot of the green environmentalist crap. So the Social Democrats are, they're an auto workers party. They're a party of unions and working men. So they don't have any great love for things like the internal combustion engine bans and so forth. So I think it's very likely that the new government walks back a lot of the crazy green stuff, or at least some of it. But otherwise, they're going to be sort of ineffectual. They don't really share any interests. It's a terrible government. It doesn't make any sense, and it's just irrationality caused by the firewall. This coalition would never have been born otherwise. Again, the SPD has just become so different than it was under Merkel. It's yeah, it's just what we have.
Okay, so let's talk about some other recent news that had bearing on this election then. And that's the Munich Security Conference, where JD Vance came in and he gave this big speech. He made a coded, not even actually that coded, reference to the firewall, saying that this is something that there shouldn't be in a democracy.
Democracy rests on the sacred principle that the voice of the people matters. There's no room for firewalls. You either uphold the principle or you don't.
And he said, stop censoring your voters, listen to your voters on immigration. It pleased people to hear the Eurocrat elites having it being stuck to them in this way by the populist representative from America there. But, my question to you is, how did that go down in German politics?
Yeah, so obviously it was a good speech, and I was a fan of JD Vance's speech. And I think if he had given a more strategic speech designed to achieve specific outcomes in German politics, it would have been less interesting and wouldn't have spoken to people as well. So there would have been a trade-off. But obviously, it pretty much drove everyone in the opposite direction. There's a few things about the American strategy with respect to Germany that seem a little puzzling and suggest to me perhaps they don't understand fully what's going on. So Musk reaching out directly to the AfD, Vance speaking directly to the firewall. It's hard to judge what exactly is their strategy, but these kinds of interventions, they cause defensive reactions in the system. I don't really believe in the whole foreign interference thing, but I think that's kind of silly to whine about this stuff, especially for a country that is interfering in everybody else's politics all the time. German foreign ministers and so forth are absolutely egregious, but it causes a defensive reaction. Vance's speech drove the CDU in the opposite direction, inspired a whole new round of denunciations of the AfD and so forth, more insistence on the firewall. So it did not have this revolutionary effect on German politics that many would have hoped for. Does that mean it was bad? No, absolutely not. I think it's also energized the AfD, the party itself, even if it hasn't driven up support for them. And it's one thing I wrote about is that one sort of has a sense that we're not alone on this side of the firewall anymore, that also the Trump administration is here as well. And it's not a terrible feeling. There's sort of a morale aspect as well. But, these kinds of things they don't translate directly into political movement on the ground in Germany or in Europe more broadly. And we're now seeing a sort of a whole anti-American freak out also in France and Germany, where everyone is looking down their nose at these rough, uncultured Americans and their crazy ideas about Russia and so forth. It's really kind of toxic and some of the worst aspects of European unearned arrogance inspired by a lot of these interactions. So I don't know whether that's good in the longer term or not. I have no idea.
And so another interesting thing about the new administration in America is that they're much more plugged into online right-wing politics. And this includes JD Vance in particular, who has been defending government policy to its critics on Twitter and sort of clarifying things and setting things out. And that, in fact, has included you. And so you raised more or less the same points that you've just mentioned to me about that speech, and he then replied to you and clarified a few things and set out, what his intentions were with that. What did you make of that experience, and what did you make of his reply?
Yeah, so it's very strange. You're talking about, a foreign political figure, and then he appears in your Twitter replies and clarifies a few points. So that was a very surreal experience. I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was a parody account or something, but it really was him. So he said, I laid out some of these, I wouldn't call them criticisms, but such as strategic and pragmatic considerations. And he responded and he said basically that he doesn't want to change anything overnight. He doesn't think that's possible, but he wanted to reach out to our American and European friends. And so I take that to mean that he sort of understands, or the Trump administration understands, European populist parties as counterparts or affiliates or just fellow travelers of Make America Great Again, MAGA Americans, and they see sort of a political kinship here and want to open a way to for populism in Europe, and that Vance believed his speech was directed to the people of the populist supporters of AfD in Germany, and also more broadly European populist parties and people on the continent. And so he didn't believe he was speaking to other elites, or he wasn't trying to achieve strategic outcomes in the German party politics, but he was rather just addressing the people. That was at least how he explained his speech to me. So that's interesting. More than that, I don't have much commentary, but it's again always a bizarre experience to have direct interaction with important people.
And I suppose finally, it is an interesting moment we're in, isn't it? I mean, so if you'd said even 2 years ago that you'd have a vice president, having a predisposition towards the AfD, and responding to people like you online, and then the AfD as well, just doing so well in the polls and being so secure in that, you would have. I mean, that's quite an extraordinary development, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's one of very great deal of political fluidity, and things are changing very fast, and things that didn't seem possible just yesterday now are just normal. This makes me very optimistic, and about things in German politics especially, I think will also begin to move before too long. Things like the firewall and these long standbys, they're on the last. They're really almost finished, and we are at a moment here. The next 2-3 years, or even 2-3 months, it's hard to say when catastrophic failures will happen, But I really think we are reaching sort of the limits of traditional political system and its longevity here, and this entirely new political environment in the United States is injecting an element of chaos and instability into what used to be a very closed, staid, boring almost German political system, and it can't really cope with that dynamism and that new energy. I think it's ultimately good, and we'll see serious changes in the coming years for sure.
Okay, well, Eugyppius, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure as always.
Now, is Rishi Sunak English? That's the question that's caused all kinds of controversy in the past week after being debated on the podcast Trigonometry between the host, Konstantin Kisin, and interviewee Fraser Nelson, former editor of The Spectator and Liberal Tory.
I would say that Rishi Sunak is as English as Tizer and Wyferns, right? He is absolutely English. He was born and bred here. And I wouldn't say that the colour of his skin makes him any
He's
less.
a brown Hindu. How is he English?
Because he's born and bred here.
So by being born here, you become English, in your opinion?
Yeah.
Now, the outraged response on both sides suggests that this is much more than just a spat over terminology between two commentators. It reflects tensions and questions about identity that, as Britain becomes ever more diverse, are increasingly salient in our politics today. And I'm very pleased to be joined by someone who's very well equipped to answer some of those questions, and that's Professor Eric Kaufmann, who's the head of the Institute of Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham, and the author of books including Whiteshift and, most recently, Taboo, which we talked about on this show last year. Welcome back to The Sceptic, Eric.
It's great to be here, Laurie. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, good to have you here. Okay, so this debate has really blown up over the past week or so and, caused a lot of controversy and outrage. Some people backing Kisin, some people backing Nelson. And, there's been a weight of feeling on both sides. But actually, from your perspective as a political scientist and a scholar of nationalism and these kinds of things, really, if one drills down into it, we'll get into some of the more thorny debates in a second, but this is more a matter of terminology, and they were really talking at cross purposes, weren't they? I mean, just to sort of illustrate that a bit for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's also worth saying that I've taught nationalism and ethnicity at university level for like 25 years. So these are like basic 101 type first week definitions, right? So there's really three things. There is state, nation, and ethnic group. State is the political unit. I'm being very crude here. Ethnic group is the community of ancestry. And nation is the sort of territorial, cultural, historical community, which has a bit of the two, state and ethnic group. So if we just look at this quite simply, they were talking past each other. So Konstantin said that Sunak is British, or Konstantin is British but not English. Fraser was saying, "Oh no, Rishi is English." Now, I think they were both trying to occupy too much territory with their terms. My assessment, and I wrote this in the Substack, that I published is there is something called British nationhood, which is the United Kingdom and all of the nation it tries to create through institutions like the monarchy and the BBC and all of that, and the NHS. That's one nation. The second set of nations are the kind of four nations, if you like. I'm going to leave Northern Ireland out of it. Happy to talk about that. But the others are the sub-state nations, England, Wales, Scotland. And those are territorial historical units with political traditions. Now that's a separate thing, and Sunak is part of that as well. The English nation, which is territorial, historical, cultural, so the accent, for example, the mannerisms, awareness of the history, going back to Magna Carta and King Alfred and all that. So, fine. So Sunak is English by national identity, but not English by ethnicity. Ethnicity means, where do you see your ancestors as having originated? What is your community of shared ancestry? He's not English by that definition. He is Hindu-Indian, let's say. And in a way, you can see that what he ticks on the census is going to be the Indian box and not the white British box. Now, I just want to say something about white British. What white British is it is a higher level than white English. So you have the ethnic origin, and the largest ethnic group in England is the ethnic English, 70% of the English population. The largest ethnic group in Scotland is the ethnic Scots, 85% of Scotland. Wales, they're only about 50% the ethnic Welsh. But if we aggregate that up to the level of Britain, we have the white British who are, 80%, and that's what we would call a pan-ethnic group. All of the British Isles ethnic majorities put together is the white British pan-ethnic group. Again, Rishi is not part of that 80%. So that's kind of a very crudely where he sits. He's English by nationality. He's not English by ethnicity. Now, why are they fighting over this? It's really interesting. I think part of this is there's a struggle over Englishness there's people who say, well, you must be ethnically English to call yourself English. There's other people who are saying, well, no, English only consists of culture and territory, and therefore anybody can be English, and Rishi is English, and they want to kind of almost push ethnicity away entirely. The issue, however, is that, in fact, actually, even the English nation, not the English ethnic group, the English nation's character is heavily informed by the fact that 70% of its population are ethnically English. That affects the character of the nation as a whole. And so it's not irrelevant for English nationhood at the aggregate level. But at the individual membership level, sure. Sunak is as English as anybody else on the question of membership. Are you a member of the English nation? I'd say yes to that. Is it irrelevant what the composition of the English nation is ethnically? No. So I'm sure Fraser Nelson, if he were asked, would say, oh, it doesn't matter what the composition is. We're just, as long as you got the English culture. And that's where I would get off the train. But on the other hand, is Sunak English in terms of nationality? Absolutely.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because the way that these discussions happen is that they often get quite moralized and quite fraught when they're applied to a given individual. And so, in the case of Rishi Sunak, I mean, most people, even if they didn't particularly think he was a great prime minister, generally think he's a nice chap. He seems friendly enough. And so it seems like a very horrible thing to say, oh, well, he's not part of our group. And then there's a sort of moral condemnation. But as you say, thinking about it in terms of individuals isn't really the right way to go about it. It's better to think about the composition. But that's not really a distinction that we're almost able to make because the taboos are so strong.
Yeah, exactly. First of all, there's such an emphasis on the individual as opposed to the collective level and the aggregate level. So a better example I like to use is if I say all accents are English accents. Because anybody with any accent who has a British passport, lives in England, considers themselves English, are you going to say they're not English if they identify as English? Now, my reaction to this is, well, someone could have a non-English accent and be English, but there's no way you can say that a French accent is an English accent. It makes no sense. at the collective level. If I say an Indian accent is an English accent, a French accent is an English accent, people would say that's ridiculous. But yet, if there's an individual with an Indian accent or a French accent who considers themselves English, identifies with the history and the memory, whatever, a lot of people would be very reluctant to exclude that person from equal membership. And I have no problem with that person having equal membership, but what I think is you can't conflate and collapse that collective level and the individual level. And I'd say the same for ethnicity. And this is one of the reasons why two things can be true. One is that someone who's not of English ethnicity is equally English in terms of nationality to someone who is of English ethnicity. However, England as a whole, if it becomes majority non-English by ethnicity, it is not as English as it was before. And it's the same principle. What we would call the fallacy of composition is to go from that collective level of like an Indian accent is an English accent down to the individual level, which is like someone with an Indian accent can be allowed to be English. It's a separate level, and therefore we have to have separate principles at the separate level. And it's actually very hard for a lot of people to get their head around. So this is why actually ethnic composition matters, even as you don't have to be white to be English. But they are the same. Actually, one doesn't preclude the other.
And so if we get onto the angry reaction to this, so one of the points that Konstantin Kisin has made is that when he said brown Hindu, what he meant was basically British Asian. That would be the politically correct term. That would be the term that Rishi Sunak describes himself as on the census. And so he's trying to say to Fraser Nelson, let's pay attention to ethnicity here for a second, can we? Meanwhile, Nelson has this kind of ideologically correct colorblind view where you're not even allowed to bring this in as a consideration at all. And I think that's partly why Kisin was somewhat exasperated. And, it does illustrate the strength of the ideological taboos here, I think, that people like Nelson feel the need to do that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things going on. One is there is the race taboo, the anti-racism taboo, which means that anybody will go to extreme lengths to avoid being tarred with that radioactive brush. As I argue in my book, Taboo, the anti-racism taboo is kind of the big bang of our moral order, the center of our moral universe. So anytime you can be tagged and with that brush, you're going to be toxic to other people. You'll be radioactive. So they will avoid it like the plague. You take a question like this one. Now, of course, Constantine also had the wrong end of the stick in a way that he didn't see that there are two kinds of English identity, the ethnic and the national. But equally, I think Fraser, just with that reflexive reaction, like, anybody, doesn't matter what your color or religion, whatever, you're equally English. His reaction is this universalistic one. And I don't know, I'm not inside Fraser's brain to know if this is fear of the running afoul of the anti-racism taboo, or that he has internalized it so much that he just truly believes that ethnic composition doesn't matter at all, has no value. I think it's maybe some combination of the two, which explains his position. It is possible, it's certainly possible that he could be sort of a universalist, global, classical liberal who believes in frictionless movement of people and goods across borders, and that's his position. And it's totally, that is a consistent position. I just can't help but feel that the atmosphere of political correctness around this, which was obtained since the 60s in elite circles at any rate, skews the way people make their arguments. I just think it does. But I'm not privy to the man's inner thoughts, and so I don't want to ascribe views to somebody who I take them at their word.
And I'm interested in your thoughts as to how this debate has evolved over time. So I think probably 30 years ago, where the white British population or white English population was considerably higher, this would have been a bit less fraught, I think, and these edge cases people perhaps wouldn't have cared so much about. Whereas now there's more of a sense of threat to the majority group for that reason, for several other reasons. I'll just go into the one most obvious recent one is the grooming gangs, of course, where that's been explicit violence and abuse targeted against this group for racial reasons, and so people are, becoming more aware of this and more sensitive about it. And do you think that this debate has become more fraught?
Yes, it's so there's a couple of things going on there. One is the question is, as the ethnic majority declines in size, do they become more self-aware? And I think the answer to that is yes. And there's some research on this in America where the white American group is smaller proportionally. They're around 60% rather than, let's say, 80% as they are here, although obviously the Hispanic thing makes it a bit confusing. But what I would say there is, the evidence shows that in counties where there's a higher share, where the whites are a smaller share, whites are more likely to express a white identity. There's been an increase, say, from the 1990s to the 2010s. There was an increase in the share of white Americans saying their white identity was in some way important to them. I mean, I think however, in general, white identification is related most to whether you identify with ancestry. So in the US case, for example, if you strongly identify with being Irish or Italian or any other background, then you're way, way more likely to identify with being white than a white American who doesn't identify with their ethnic background. And so I kind of see this as just a sort of outer skin of some attachment to ancestors or ancestry. And yeah, I do think it's inevitable as the group declines, there's going to be growing salience of this identity. The other thing, too, is don't forget we're also in a long-term ideological evolution where you had the mid-'60s anti-racism taboo, the big bang of our moral universe, as I would argue. It just expands. The meaning of anti-racism and racism expands outward, reaching a peak maybe around 2020, 2021. So we have that 60-year period of, or maybe 50, what is that now? Getting my math out, 55 years. And then we've had a little bit of retrenchment in the last few years, just 2-3 years, which is interesting. But it suggests that we may be in a place where there's a potential for change now that there's a bit more reflection and skepticism over the automatic moral rightness of even the most extreme claims around anti-racism. And it's perhaps opening up a conversation, which I think we need to have, around ethnic majorities. And I should say there's even now the odd academic book, and there was one that I contributed to, and I'm looking on my shelf, I can't remember. And Liev Orgad is someone who's written about majorities. Koopmans and Orgad edited the volume, which I'm thinking of, just talking about majority rights for the first time, that this is something political philosophers need to start to think about as majorities in the West decline. What are, their argument is that their rights claims gain force as they decline in number. And this is something political philosophy is going to need to take on board. Ruud Koopmans and Liev Orgad's book. So I think it's, and one of the arguments I try to make is, again, this argument about just because you say the ethnic composition matters and it's something possibly to slow down change to, it does not mean that you think a non-white person cannot be an equal member of the nation. The left has often tried, and even the liberals have tried to conflate those two to shut down the debate immediately. I think that's untenable. As the shift, by the time we hit the end of this century, of course, Western European countries are projected to be past that majority-minority point, and that'll happen in North America in the middle of this century, and Australia and New Zealand around the same time. So, these debates are going to be happening with greater and greater frequency. And just to say, oh, it doesn't matter, I don't think is legitimate. And the other thing I should say is there's a whole study of ethnic demography and politics around the world, and what happens as that shifts. And countries that don't have an ethnic majority, there's evidence to suggest these are not as successful for a number of reasons. One is you have more ethnic politics, which means you have less agreement on where to build roads and hospitals, and it's harder to get cooperation and trust. So there's a whole literature on that in the developing world, which I think is also potentially relevant for the developed world.
And so one of the rhetorical strategies really that's used to downplay concern about this a lot of the time is to say, well, we've always been a nation of immigrants. And I think Fraser Nelson actually does that in this interview where he says something like, countries always change, in references, the Saxons and the Normans and the Huguenots or whatever. And you've actually explained that this really, in your Substack piece, this really is a fallacy. Can you, just take us through why that is?
Well, I mean, certainly if you take Britain, the immigration's always been very small. So it's a bit like, there has been, of course, and at certain times there have been invasions, but really it's a bit like a loaf of bread, and the crust is the immigrant contribution over time. It's been there, absolutely, but it's always been a very small part. The native born have always been the overwhelming majority. The other thing to say is that the level of diversity is sometimes going up, but it's sometimes going down because of intermarriage and assimilation and melting. And therefore, Huguenots, they're disappeared into the British, the American, the South African population. The Huguenot basically completely assimilated. So no one knows that, Paul Revere or, what's his name? Is it Paul Greenleaf Whittier? I'm just thinking of a couple of Americans that have Huguenot background, but or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. No one would actually think about them as Huguenots, and that's what I mean is that yes, you may have had some immigrants coming in, but they would be assimilated. So the degree of immigration and the impact on the ethnic demography is just that much greater today. But it's often a trope that the nations have always been nations of immigrants. They've been predominantly nations of native-borns with a very small contribution from immigrants is the accurate way of saying it.
Yes, and one other thing you mentioned in that is that this word English, well, yes, it did, draw from a fusion of several groups in the past. It has actually, become a coherent and stable identity over time.
Yeah, so you had England is one of the earliest ethnic groups to form, in the 9th century. There's already mention of the English in Venerable Bede from the 800s or 700s. So that's quite old. It's older than a lot of groups like Germans, Russians, and so it's been around for a long time. Now, of course, there were people that assimilated in. The Vikings and Danes, were eventually the Normans were assimilated. But you have this long tradition of having an identity. And so it is not it's not a recent invention, number one, but also it's been dominated by by a continuous native-born construct for quite a long time, even though, of course, yes, there are new loan words from French. There are new traditions like fish and chips. Of course, there's a certain degree of change at all times, but it's a bit like if we talk about change in the English language, how many words have been added of immigrant origin? Yeah, there are new words that come into the language, but as a percentage of the total vocabulary of English, it's much less impressive. Where people will always say, "Oh, hamburger and whatever," these new words came, and so we're just an immigrant mix. Well, actually, again, it's about where do you focus, right? So there is an immigrant contribution, but the people who want to talk it up will greatly inflate and amplify the significance of that contribution. As it's like, how many loan words have come into English? Yes, there have been some. Yes, they've been brought in by immigrants. As a percentage of the total, it's very small. So the focus is always on what's different rather than what's the same and continuous, which is unsexy, but actually is much bigger part of the story.
The top 100 most commonly used words in English are all Anglo-Saxon in origin. Fun fact. Okay, so let's move on though to what's happening in America. So obviously, you write a lot about woke culture, particularly in Taboo in your latest book. And that is, I'd say, mostly about the sociology more than the politics, which is to say, why we think these things and why these cultural ideas are so powerful. And, well, of course, politically, the Trump administration is very much going to war with woke. They're going to war with DEI and things related. Well, to what extent do you think that shift in politics and institutions is going to also be able to change the underlying culture?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. We've got kind of two things going on. They're not unrelated, but they're also substantially separate. I mean, one is the populist backlash to DEI, critical race theory, the trans agenda. And that is being spearheaded by the Trump administration. So what they're essentially trying to do is take the, 2/3 of the public in the US, as in Britain, as in Canada, is anti-woke. But the institutions are generally woke. So what they're now doing is they're trying to puncture holes in these institutions and let the atmosphere, if you like, from society into these institutional echo chambers. And that means they're reforming the institutions to make them reflect the values of the mainstream society. So that's one political project, which I think is a very urgent one and is very important. I think that is a long-term project. The idea that will be done in a day is really not right. I think that until you get into the schools, until you actually start chilling people who try and relabel offices of DEI or relabel critical race theory as something else and still keep teaching the same stuff, it's going to be a long process of actually weeding all this stuff out and keeping it out. But it is ongoing, and it's been quite successful at government level, National Science Foundation, the USAID, Department of Education. So a lot of real high-profile targets. So they're doing a very important job and a very good job. Universities are also implicated because they get a lot of government money. So they're trying at least to hide, again, how much. Sometimes they are getting rid of DEI in a real sense, and at other times they're trying to shapeshift. This is going to be a long-running battle. And we'll see what the courts say about it. But that's the political battle. The second thing, however, which I think is actually in some ways more interesting, is this vibe shift thing, which has to do with the intellectual elites of the US and to some extent elsewhere, losing confidence in this, what I think is a 120-year project of cultural left liberalism, but certainly since the 1960s, a 60-year progressive project. And whether it be Black Lives Matter, defund the police, trans, I think, or DEI or free speech, I just think there's at least a questioning and reflection, like maybe this thing went too far, and maybe we let, at least in the case of the older elite liberals, maybe we let the younger radicals too close to the centers of power, and actually these beliefs are maybe not that prestigious and not that intelligent, and they don't really do anything rational. Now, so I think there's kind of like this, quite apart from Trump, there is this rethink going on amongst the most intelligent elite left liberal or center left people. And that's, I think, in some ways could be more important, because the question is what that means. Where is elite opinion going to go? The New York Times, on the top networks, at the top level of tech firms, are they moving back to colorblind classical liberalism? And what does that actually mean now for the whole progressive project? Because you don't just suddenly say, oh, well, we've been winning everything for 60 years. Oh, we started to lose. We lost on trans. We lost on Black Lives Matter. We lost on DEI. I mean, that's pretty enormous when you've dominated everything around race, gender, and sexuality for 60 years. I don't think it's that easy to just stop peddling and expect to stand still. I think the question now is, what happens to that dominant intellectual sensibility? And I have this term, which I've just got a piece out in a journal now on something which I call post-progressivism. Are we entering a new intellectual era, which is marked by what I call post-progressivism? So it's the end of the 60 years, 1965 to 2025. I know that's not exactly the years, but are we entering into a new period? That's another question, which I think is quite an interesting one. And Matthew Iglesias talked about, who's on the left. He said, progressive ideas have run out of juice. That loss of confidence is palpable. And one of the reasons you don't see a real energetic resistance backlash to Trump this time around is because those ideas are no longer energetic. There's not the same enthusiasm. There's not the same novelty behind them. So they're floundering because they've lost that moxie, if you like.
And I think you'll definitely say no to this because it's against your hypothesis. But if the political incentives has now changed, and that means that a lot of people who were woke or woke-ish have now resiled from that stance, does that mean that wokeness was always a paper tiger?
Well, no, I don't think it is a paper tiger, and I think we also underestimate it at our peril. So even though the elite, senior elite, maybe has moved away from this, there are still a lot of woke people in the population who are very active politically, and you could see that they're not backing down at the Democratic National Convention. They're not backing down. The progressive activists, the More in Common survey that was recently published shows that, there's still a significant chunk of whatever that is, 8 to 10% progressive activists. And yeah, I don't expect that young people as well. Young people, there's a significant woke component to the young population, particularly the young female population. Now, it is also true that among the young population, there has been a shift, to the right. There's no question that's occurred. But there's also a chunk of people that are very woke and were kind of indoctrinated in those beliefs through school, and who strongly believe in them. And that is a larger group than older sections of the population. So the share of young people who think J.K. Rowling should be dropped by her publisher, who believe in defund the police or some of these other slogans, is considerably larger than amongst middle-aged people. So when those young people become the median voter, I think woke ideas are going to have potentially another resurgence, at least in terms of power. I do, however, think that Gen Z group is going to be very polarized around these issues. So there's also a strong anti-woke young population. So it's going to be very interesting to watch where that goes. So I wouldn't count it out by any stretch. I mean, I kind of liken the Great Awakening to the Islamic Revival. Islamic Revival takes place within a population that is Muslim. The countries where the Islamic Revival happens are generally Muslim countries where most people believe in Islam. And likewise, the Great Awakening, which I argue is the third, not the first awakening, happens in countries where what Jonathan Haidt would call the care, harm, and equality moral foundations, those left liberal core moral foundations, are the dominant ones. And that means that there's always this potential for a wave of enthusiasm to occur based on those principles. Just as in a Muslim society, you can have an Islamic fundamentalist revival at any time. And again, until we actually start questioning those core principles of the Western moral order, that equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for race, gender, sexual minority groups, that is not the highest value in society. Until we get to that position where we say, those are values, of course, but they're values alongside other equal values, and we have to make trade-offs. But until we get to that position, right now, anytime someone makes an accusation, look at this Konstantin Kisin thing, wheeling out the racism accusation carries a moral charge that wheeling out, let's say, elitism or class prejudice just wouldn't carry the same weight, which tells you that the fundamental value ordering remains in place. It's just that woke has overstepped and has lost a bit of its energy, but it doesn't mean that there's been any major shift in the highest values in society. And that's one of the things that I think does need to change for us to sort of put this on an enduring footing so we don't have another one of these awakenings in 20 years.
And so finally, given that this is very much still the moral operating system that American society is under, how significant is it, therefore, that you have people in the Trump administration, I'm thinking in particular of JD Vance, but others too, who are very much unlike previous generations of the Republicans, are willing to be called racist or whatever else for deportations or going after DEI or going after affirmative action, and they're not letting that cow them, and they're saying, actually, no, we're going to do it anyway, no matter what you say. I mean, that's a huge change, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a change. Absolutely, it is a change. Up until the 2008 thereabouts, but even really into the 2010s, in the Republican Party, criticizing affirmative action was basically almost seen as offside. It was very difficult to do. Criticizing immigration and wanting to reduce it again, similarly. So there's the pre-Trump Republican Party, which was kind of overthrown the Republican National committee was overthrown by Trump. And that's changed it. Now, has it changed it completely? No. Yes, it is true that obviously Vance reinstating that guy who said, what did he say? Indian hate? I can't remember, some sort of online thing, and he got canceled for it and they brought him back. I mean, obviously that is clearly the fact they got away with that does represent that, suggests cancel culture has weakened its power. At the same time, you don't yet hear Trump and Vance saying, we want to maintain the ethnic composition of the United States, or we want to slow down the change. We want to reduce immigration so that ethnic change slows down. I haven't heard that, and I would be quite surprised to hear that, because I still think there are taboos which exist. So they're willing to break some taboos, but I'm still not sure they're willing to break others. I could be wrong there. But I still think that these ideas are at the center of the American moral universe. And one worry I have is I think, okay, Trump and Vance are certainly challenging and trolling, but are they changing the moral order? They're kind of going in and saying, well, we're not abiding by your moralistic creed. We're rejecting your moralism. So we're going to kind of almost be like amoral. And I don't think that's a sustainable position. And I think it's ultimately not going to win in the long term, which is one of my disappointments. I would have liked to have seen them make a moral argument. I know it's hard if you're Trump, but something like, these people took our trust in institutions that are supposed to be neutral, like the bureaucracy in schools, and they've essentially broken our trust by smuggling in radical ideas and rebadging them as moral and neutral, and that is a betrayal. Something like that, which would suggest that these people have done something really morally awful, I think would be needed to kind of elevate the discussion and put this all on a firmer footing. I'm just worried that when you're just going for this thing like, we hate your moralism, and so screw morality, especially when it's paired in with positions on Ukraine and other things, which are clearly not shared by a lot of people. I just think it's a fragile way to go to the next step. We'll see. Maybe Vance will, if he's the nominee in 2028, maybe he will sort of create something new or build on this in a different way, because he's clearly not Trump, doesn't have that baggage. But we'll see.
Now, of course, I know you know a lot about Canadian politics as well, and there's been this fascinating turnaround recently, hasn't there? So, people kind of are expecting that the election of Trump would be a boon to conservatives across the world, right? But actually, in Canada, it's really been the opposite of that. Tell us what's happening there.
Well, yeah, this is really the dilemma in a way, is that Trump is not necessarily a boon to conservatives outside the United States. There's really two faces, and this is an article I'm working on now, but there's really two types of nationalism. There's the cultural nationalism, which is restricting immigration, taking on woke. All of that stuff, I think, is hugely popular and strengthens conservatism in the rest of the world. But then there is political nationalism, really, which is about throwing your weight around, exerting sovereignty, perhaps imperialism. And this is actually something that threatens other countries. Now, what that means is that actually, in the Canadian case, when you joke about Canada being the 51st state and that you're going to throw 25% tariffs, that's an enormous threat to Canada. And so Canadians rally around the flag. And as we saw during COVID, whenever there's a rally around the flag effect, that benefits the incumbent. And so Trudeau and the Liberals are reaping the benefits of Trump. And they're now, on some polls, coming close to the Conservatives, where they were back 20 points in the past. So this has very much damaged conservatism in Canada. I suspect Trump, what they're saying on Ukraine, and also the threats on tariffs to Europe. If tariffs were to hit Britain and the EU in a significant way, such as, obviously Britain and Europe are not as large a trading partner as Canada is with the US, but still, to the extent that's seen as threatening to the sovereignty, to the interests of Europe and Britain, that's also potentially something that incumbent leaders can rally people around, and that will weaken this cultural nationalism. So I kind of think, my view is that the U.S., in pursuing both the the cultural stuff, which is very popular around the world, but the political stuff, which I actually think is unpopular. I think they're actually weakening their brand. And I don't know quite how this plays out, but Trump obviously has this predilection for tariffs and for, saying, throwing American weight around, which I think could be counterproductive, at least to the broader movement, if you like.
Okay, well, Professor Eric Kaufmann, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thanks, Laurie.
Now, another issue that goes to the heart of the immigration and integration debate is the shocking recent wave of violent attacks against European citizens by people of a migrant background. France, Germany, and Austria are just 3 of the countries that have been blighted by this mindless violence in the past month. Meanwhile, here in the UK, we're still reeling from the horrors of last summer's atrocity in Southport. So just what is behind this terrifying new normal? Well, to find out, I'm very pleased to be joined by Chris Bayliss, who's an independent consultant and a writer for publications including The Critic. Welcome to The Sceptic, Chris.
Good morning. How are you doing? Glad to be on.
Okay, so obviously Southport is the big one that people have in their minds, but there's also the Magdeburg Christmas market attack. There's several others recently as well. And when these kinds of attacks happen, immediately there's great concern with trying to identify a specific ideology that might have motivated the attackers and basically to say, well, was it Islamism or wasn't it? And you've written this quite influential article recently for The Critic, which, well, it's really clarified my thinking about this, actually, which is that these attacks really are better explained by, well, what is called in the title of it, the nihilism of newcomers. And let me just quote you from that as well. So these attacks are the ultimate expression of contempt and resentment for a society that the attackers do not understand and feel no connection to. And so, well, could you just explain a little bit more what you meant by that?
Yeah, well, I think a big part of the issue that we've got is that for us in Western Europe, it feels like the attacks that we've been experiencing in the last sort of 10 years or so have been part of a continuum that never really stopped from the era of what I describe as mass Islamist terrorism. Obviously 9/11 being the biggest example of, and then in the UK, the 7/7 attacks. And I think we've got a tendency to think about terrorism in that context, and what we're experiencing today is basically the same phenomenon. So the reason I wrote that article and tried to explain it in those terms is to make the point that actually what we're facing now is very different. I think looking back to...
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.